Hey everyone, welcome to my talk here at DarkCON. I am Dark. I go by Darkstar7471 on Twitter. And today I'm going to be talking about SIEM. So specifically, we're going to talk about finding your foes with an introduction to SIEM. First, let's go ahead and go through the overview. Again, overview, woohoo, it's this slide. I hope you could tell that. We're going to talk about what's a SIEM, what different flavors we can have in that, why do I care about SIEMs, what can we actually look at with SIEMs, different limitations that we see, which is something that not a lot of people necessarily talk about. We'll talk about a demo I'm going to go ahead and run through using Alien Vault's or AT&T Alien Vault's online demo here in just a little bit. That's something that you can play around with at home. We're going to do some further exercises, or I'll show you where you can do some further exercises to play with this, and then we'll get into our conclusion. Quick little about me. I am a penetration tester at State Farm. Additionally, I am the content director and community manager over at tryhackme.com. I handle the release queue. I handle what content comes out. And I also manage the community and all of sponsorship and things like that. So what's a SIEM? SIEM stands for Security, Information, and Event Management. Think of it as a giant bucket. And when I say a bucket, traditionally you're putting water or something liquid in a bucket. In this case, we're putting our logs in the bucket so that we can consolidate them and start looking through them. This is done for the primary purpose of being able to detect threat actors on our network and being able to see when things go wrong. One of the more interesting things that you can get out of this, and that's more useful on a day-to-day basis, is you can often see when there are misconfigurations within your domain or within a company from your SIEM, because you'll start seeing alerts, and you can, if you are experienced or you have the alerts set up correctly, you will be able to see where something's wrong. So again, we talked about it being a bucket. This is primarily for information collection. So you're looking at a couple different sources. Primarily, it's going to be host intrusion detection, your HIDS system. In this case, I'll be talking about OSEC. You don't necessarily need to know what that is if you don't have any experience with SIEMs. I'll talk about that in just a little bit. Host intrusion detection, the HIDS part is an agent that's installed on each one of the computers that you want to monitor. A lot of times this is going to be, you can put it on your endpoints. Some people do that. I recommend doing that. Endpoints, I mean computers that your employees are using. Then you can also have them on web servers and things like that. And that's where they're very, very important. Anything that's externally facing is something that you absolutely want these on. Getting it from your host or individual host can be a lot of data, but it is worth it if you can get it. The second bit of this is the actual net flow. Now, net flow has to do with, as you might have guessed, your actual data flow in and out of the network. This is typically done via a mirror port. Depending on the size of your organization, this can be a lot of data. For smaller organizations, this can be easier. For larger ones, it's worthwhile doing this just because NetFlow provides a ton of value. But again, it's a lot of data and you need to be able to handle it. It's a traffic duplicator. So think of, you take a port on your switch or your router and you just mirror it. So everything that goes in that port also goes out of that port, rather, also goes out of another port, and that port goes straight to your SIEM so that you can start analyzing that. Let's talk about some flavors. So first we have Alien Vault OSIM or USM. This is something that I am professionally trained on from a previous position that I had. This is the one that I have the most experience with. This is one that I find works really well for small to medium-sized clients, depending on the application. I know that they are moving to a cloud-based system, which I understand is better for larger clients, but it's a nice SIEM that specifically OSIM, that's something that you can play around with at home. Additionally, there is the IBM Q Radar. That is something that you can use. I know that it's just IBM's solution for this. I've seen that it is really popular and it's really, really nice. Next, we have Splunk, which isn't necessarily specifically a SIEM solution. Splunk can be used for a lot of things. It's used for number crunching. It is an analytics engine more than anything. However, one of its most popular purposes is for doing data collection for using it as a SIEM. Yeah, so Splunk is something that it has a lot of uses. Unfortunately, it can have a very high skill gap, or a high takes a lot of training on to get used to it, just because there's a lot you can do with it. It's a prime example of a tool that gives you a lot up front, that you have a lot of options and a lot of flexibility, but because of that, it can be very daunting at first, especially for new users. I've alluded to this a little bit. These vary in purpose and target business environment. Those are the primary things that you want to consider when you are looking at a different one. Again, if you're just playing with one of these at home, there's also Greylog, which I believe classifies as a SIM. I'm not sure, but OSIM is something that I've played with at home, and I find that it works pretty well for a home lab environment. So you're going to consider your size, how much data that you're getting in, and then the type of business as well. Traditionally, if you are running a bigger business, you are probably going to have these layered up, just because Splunk you can do a lot of custom work with. It's very common to see Splunk on the back end that's doing a bunch of custom learning, and you have layers of these SIMs that are catching different things because of different alarms that are plugged into them. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So why do you actually care? So let's talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly. So what we care about catching scans. One of the biggest things that I like to point out, and this is whenever I'm talking about, for example, the Mmap room on TryHackMe, is that a lot of people like to claim that Mmap scans or just basic network scans are stealthy, especially if you're using the -s or lowercase s, capital S option on Nmap. Well, I hate to break it to you, I hate to burst your bubble here. If you have a SIM that's set up that has net flow and can capture the network traffic, they're not stealthy at all. It's actually pretty obvious. Those are all run in different patterns, and those patterns are well known. Those tools are open source. It's very easy to see what's going on there, and they've existed for a long time at this point, especially in the world of cybersecurity. So we can catch that, which is awesome. We want to see when scans are going on, because that gives us a pretty good idea of either we know that someone is within our environment and scanning, and we want to know about that, or we see that scanning that's going on that's unauthorized. And I mean, that's not good. That's a big issue, because it means that we probably have an incident that we need to be looking into, or we need to resolve if there's potentially an unknown pen test that's going on and we're being tested as blue team operators. The next thing that we'd be looking at catching is the active exploitation attempts. A lot of times with the HIDS agents, they will have signatures built in for catching things like sending different packet patterns and so on and so forth. Specifically, so let's talk about, for example, on Windows. If you are trying to use a privesc method, such as one of the potato methods, those have a pretty distinctive signature, and that'll pop up on one of these, more than likely. So we can see those active exploitation attempts because they have known patterns. That's also the main reason why it pays to not use off-the-shelf tools if you are a red teamer and actively want to be able to bypass antivirus, or AV rather. Those have known signatures, and compiling your own, you're usually going to get past that. Network anomalies. So I mentioned this a little bit before. We can find issues in our network, which really falls under that bad qualities. Things that we can see things that are wrong. One of the prime examples here are DNS issues, because you can start seeing DNS lookup failures. A lot of times those will come up in the alarms. That can also come up as active scanning as well, because you can see someone scanning for different vhosts. You can do that with GoBuster and start looking for things, different host names that things would go by. We can also see service account lockouts. This is something that happens a lot in a business environment, just because service accounts break, and this is something that you should be changing the account password to at least every year or so, ideally. But we can see account lockout failures. It's one of the most common alerts that you are going to see, other than scans, just because anything that's out on the internet, if you are conducting NetFlow and HIDS data from it, you're going to see that it's getting scanned, because things that are out on the internet, well, they get scanned. One tangent here: if you've ever heard someone give you the advice that you shouldn't just leave, like, a Pi hole or another Raspberry Pi project or something else, or whatever your game server is, facing out on the public internet from your private home network, this is why, because it's going to get scanned, and if it has any issues with it and you are not keeping it up to date, some threat actor is probably going to write an automated bot that will go through and compromise it. So With a SIM, if you are collecting data off of that, you can see that, and that's what can result sometimes in those service account lockouts. Additionally, we can see data transfers and exfiltration. That's one of the more interesting things out of this, that from NetFlow, you can start seeing these big data transfers happen. While it's not always possible to see everything with this, especially some of the more stealthy data transfer methods, such as with DNS requests and things like that, we can start to see, even just looking at heuristical data and looking at how much data is moving in and out of our environment, we can start to see where things look a little weird. For example, if you see one host sending, 100,000 DNS lookup requests, that host is probably bad. And again, you can see that exfiltration. One of the things that a lot of SIEMs will have built in is system monitoring. So looking at uptime and service availability, you can have that where if a HIDS agent is not responding, it will start setting off alarms after a little bit. Very nice if you want to do just some basic monitoring. That can be done with a number of different tools, but a lot of these just have it built in. Additionally, one of the best parts of a SIEM, depending on who you ask, is they're great at making you look busy, especially when you have a lot of alarms sitting in front of you. It is a great way to have your boss walk by, and he looks at what you're doing and sees that you're busy, and he just smiles knowing that you're a busy little beaver at your desk and you're doing a great job, even though it's just a bunch of alarms coming in. Keep in mind, when I say a bunch of alarms coming in, that's something that can happen just because, there are normal things that happen on a domain. For example, that service account lockouts. And as I mentioned, with things sitting on the internet, things get scanned. That's not necessarily an issue. I mean, you want to block IPs that are scanning you constantly, that you don't want them scanning you. But you can see things that just pop up, and there's not necessarily a lot you can do about some of these things. What can we actually look at? And I apologize for the poor graphic. That is one that doesn't show up very well in video. That is the Open Threat Exchange, OTX by Alien Vault. That is a service that I'll talk about a little bit more in a moment. It allows us to exchange threat signatures between researchers. So what can we look at? Host logs. We can look at the Windows event log. Super duper interesting. Event viewer. If you've ever played around with it, you've probably noticed that there is a ton of information that Windows gives you, and you can get that off of there. There are different services that you can make that a little bit more queryable and easier to work with. However, at first glance with a SIEM, we can pull it off and start getting some useful things right away. Additionally, we can see Linux syslog, very, very useful. We can also see service logs, which is going to be really helpful to us, especially if we have a very prominent web server, for example, that's sitting on the internet. We want to see if someone potentially accesses an administrator page, and we can see that in the web server requests, where suddenly we have a GET request for something that, someone shouldn't be able to get. Very, very useful to us, and you can set up different alerts from that. Additionally, from NetFlow, we can see active connections. From this, if you get lucky, you can see C2 communications. That's something that, in my experience, is typically, you will observe that either with known signatures or with just known signatures in the form of immature threat actors. And when I say immature, I mean people that are not really going out of the box. They're just using either ransomware or just some sort of malware that is just being drop shipped and sold either on the black market or something like that. And they don't change the C2 communication signature of it. A lot of the times, those are very quickly documented by security researchers such as ourselves, and those become signatures in your SIEM. Additionally, attempted exploits, I referenced this a little bit earlier. You can see those come in externally. It's very common to see different attacks against devices depending on the signatures that they are displaying online. And when I say signature, I mean, think of maybe your router is exposed on the public internet. Ideally, it's not, but if it's exposed on the public internet, someone can be scanning that, and if it's potentially a vulnerable version, it's probably going to have attempted exploits run against it by bots. Additionally, we can get IP reputation, and this is where that Open Threat Exchange OTX comes into play. With this, we can share our threat signatures between security researchers, and we can start getting different reputations built up for IPs. And we can label IP addresses in entire areas and IP blocks as bad, and they're just known to be used by threat actors. That's actually really common to see that pop up for AWS or DigitalOcean or other rented services, just because you can see where a lot of those with dynamically generated servers, that threat actors would find that pretty, convenient, because that's not their infrastructure. Here's a good diagram that I had found that kind of shows how a SIEM works. So you see over on the left that we have the firewall, the server, IPS, routers, switches, workstation, all of the logs, all of the data from that, and we can funnel it into the bucket that is the SIEM, and we can put it all together. With this, you can start building out your kill chains, and even if you do have an instance of compromise that you need to start forming incident response to, you can see how things fit together. You can look at the logs, you can look at the timestamps and see when things happened, and you can usually start to get a picture of what went wrong, when it went wrong, and who done it. Some limitations. So again, this is something that not everyone talks about. SIEMs do have limitations. They're not a panacea. They're not a cure-all, as much as we would love that in the security community. So the first one is HTTPS. So we can see where DNS requests are going to, unless secure DNS is being used. But HTTPS, we can't see the actual data in there, which is good because that's to be expected. With this, this becomes a little bit trickier for school environments where you need SSL stripping and things like that, specifically because a lot of schools, especially in the United States, are required to monitor that content that goes outbound because, well, they want to make sure that you're not looking up something that's inappropriate for a school environment, either just is somehow inappropriate there. So you can see where SSL stripping, it can be done with this, but generally speaking, SIEMs don't do that. There are other products that will do that for you, but again, it's a little bit of a mixed bag there. Additionally, data limitations. What you give is what you get. If you aren't giving data to your SIEM, it's not going to give you any useful information back. If you have HIDS data from one host on your network out of 3,000, you are going to get next to nothing. I hope you really care about that host because you went through a lot of time and effort to get data off of one host for setting up your SIEM. Very, very bad idea. But you need to ideally put as much into it as possible. You need to make sure that you have long-term data storage solutions for this. If you can store this data, it's going to make auditing very easy. This is something that we find is I've found rather in my past experiences that having this data stored can give you access logs, and it can make giving data to auditors pretty easy, especially in PCI environments. Depth and finding the needle in the haystack. So this is something that especially is relevant with Splunk. If you have a bunch of data, you may not necessarily know what you were looking at, especially as a new SOC operator, the Security Operations Center rather. You may not know what you're looking at, and this is where experience is key. The more time you spend looking at your SIEM solution, and the more time you have with eyes on glass, you will start getting used to what is normal, what shouldn't be there, what attack patterns you've seen, and you'll start seeing things that jump out at you that shouldn't be there. So again, limitation there is that you do need to have that experience, and it's something that's gained over time. Suggested requirements. This is something that is just general requirements if you want to set up a SIEM at home. This is something that I just put together in case you want to play with OSIM, and I'll have that linked in the slides. ESXi vSphere works very well for this. That is VMware's server version of VMware Workstation. There is a free version of it available, and it works very well for all this. You can also put other virtual machines on this. However, I don't recommend it. A SIEM is a very, very big appliance. It's probably not something you're going to want to leave up on your home network for incredibly long, but it's a great way to play with it. Ideally, you want about 8 CPU cores. This is very intensive. It's very CPU intensive. It's very RAM intensive for doing queries, so 16 gigs of RAM is great, and then 1 to 2 terabytes of storage, if not even more. Again, you're going to want more for a home, or less for a home network, more for a business network, and then you need several NICs. That's because your mirror port, and whenever you're collecting data, it needs a dedicated port that is coming in on. So these are general business recommendations. Your mileage may vary. And again, it's just kind of a what works for your environment. This is something that I recommend going with for a baseline for something like OSIM, but you can adjust it as necessary. All right, we're going to go ahead and jump into a demo. When we're back, I'm going to go ahead and pull up the Alien Vault OSIM or SIEM solution online, and we'll walk through that just a little bit. I'm going to show you what an alert looks like and show you what looking at digging into that a little bit can get you. And we're back. Okay, so I've gone ahead and pulled up the Alien Vault demo, and you can probably see right away that this is a lot of data that we are seeing. This is something I do have linked in the slide notes as well, and again, I'll put the slides out with the talk itself. So digging into this, we can see first off on our dashboard here, we can see our total number of alarms today, along with this week, along with our deltas compared to either last week or yesterday. Very helpful, especially if you are seeing a lot of pretty consistent data throughout the work week. And this is something that you expect to be relatively consistent, so you can start seeing if things are wrong here. Over here on the right, we can see alarms by intent. This is something that a lot of SIEM solutions have, or something similar to this. You can see that we have different bubbles that are either bigger or smaller, depending on how many alarms we've gotten in that time frame that you can see down here, in which category that they actually fall into. So everything that we get is actually categorized with the MITRE numbering system, so we can actually see where things fall into an attack or kill chain rather, and we can start seeing the entire picture. So putting together the actual attack using the little bits of data that we know and just going from there. Over here on the left, we can see different event data sources, so we can see where our data is actually coming from. This is helpful to see if one of these all of a sudden goes down. You'll usually get an alert for low log volume or things like that, but again, useful. We can see what's kicking things out. We can see that we have different patterns here for the actual events. This is fairly typical to have a pattern form here just because of the 5-day work week, so just something to be aware of, but you can see how we get a little bit of an overview there. We can see our sensor activity, so wherever we have sensors in the network, this is kind of an Alien Vault thing, so I won't go into that too much. We can see different discovery things for our actual network. This has a vulnerability scanner built in. I don't believe if they have that anymore, but they at least do asset discovery. There are different little features that you can find depending, and here you go, you can see the vulnerability scanner. Different little features that you can find per each SIEM that you're working with. Let's go ahead and look at the different alarms. So you can see that I had quite a number of options. Again, there's a lot here. You can see different alarms that we can actually play with, along with the actual events feed itself. So we have alarms that are generated by events. The events are the actual things that are coming in from our devices. The alarms are typically what we care about, though. And let's take a look at this first alarm here, this high. So we have the CNC, so C2 communication, malware beaconing to C2. We can see its priority here, so the severity right there, the alarm status, this is something you can close if you have already addressed it. This is very helpful if you have multiple operators looking at the same SIEM setup, which is fairly typical. Usually you're going to have multiple people looking at these alarms. We can see the actual source that this is coming from, and then the destination if it's outbound of our network or within our network as well. We can drill down in here so we can actually take a look at the other events or other alarms that are associated with the sources and destinations. Very helpful, especially if you want to see if there are things that predate this C2 beacon. And typically you're going to see a lot more where there's smoke, there's fire kind of thing. So you're going to start being able to drill down and actually find more useful information there. Let's go ahead and click into this, and we can see that we have a little pop-up on the side. So here we have the total summary of the C2 beacon that we're actually observing. We can see the status again. We can see the malware family, very useful. That we can see that this is going to link to OTX, so Open Threat Exchange, that it's going to start talking about pulses from that. So those are the actual indicators that we can share with the community. We can see the HTTP hostname that's involved, the rule attack ID. Again, this is referencing the MITRE framework. The tactics, so command and control there. The sensor that it's actually coming from, along with some additional data. In this case, we can see the events that actually generated this alarm. So again, alarms are generated as a result of these events happening. And we can see them down in here. Typically, it'll be more than one. However, this is a case of a pretty severe event so we can see that why this actually popped up in this case. We have a brief description, and then we have the strategy. So it looks like communication from your system to a malware C2 server has been identified. This is an indicator that your system has malware installed. Super bad, something we would look into if this were in a demo environment. And then the intent, system compromised alarms identify behavior associated with compromised systems or user accounts. We can see just general information about what we're looking at. Additionally, Alien Vault will attempt to supply a recommendation down here of what we should do. And these are pretty general steps, and they're usually pretty spot on, at least for the general process that you want to follow. There are a couple more things that we can do here, like creating rules, how we want to, if we want to notify on this, or so for example, if we want to send an email whenever we see something like this, this can be helpful if you're trying to root something out. We can create a suppression rule if we know that this is a false positive and we know that this is not anything useful to us, and then we can also do actions from this. So get forensics information. This can run an action on the actual afflicted host. So for example, we can capture the actual memory, see what's going on there. We can scan it, and in this case, it's an authenticated scan, so it'll actually log in and scan that machine, and then we can also query information with it. So very useful. You can see that how there's a lot of information that's presented to us here that we can use to start drilling down into the actual issues that are present within our network. Yeah, definitely something that I recommend playing with. This is one of the cases where just playing around with this, setting it up, messing up the setup process a couple times, and just making sure that you can start getting data in, and even having this just set up on your home lab if you're doing different attacks, like installing different vulnerable virtual machines, you can get a lot of educational value out of this. Let's go ahead and I'm going to pause this. We'll be back to the slides in just a second. All right, and we're back. There you can see the link to that demo. You can just enter in bogus information there if you want to, and if you want to play around with that. SIEM is the free version of this for home usage. Again, it's a very big install. I definitely do recommend playing with it though. If you are interested in this and want to learn more, here's a couple exercises that you can do. So first and foremost, there is a Splunk exercise room on TryHackMe. That's a little bit dated at this point. I would actually recommend taking a look at the entire blue path now, and then the SIEM installation that I referenced a couple times that is absolutely worthwhile going and tooling around with. So in conclusion, having a SIEM will give you enhanced visibility into your actual network. It's going to improve your understanding of that network as well, provide you a means to establish defenses, and it'll make you 100% cooler. And that is going to do it. If you guys have any questions, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter. It is going to be at darkstar7471, or you can email me, or so on and so forth. I'm on the Discord, but otherwise, you guys have a great time with the rest of this conference.